morning to all of you. Last year, the faculty of the Summer Institute of Theology and Disability came up with the idea to find a way to recognize the presence of new scholars in what we have come to name as the field of theology and disability. And when we were talking about how to go about that, the idea was to create a lectureship, so have an annual lecture enabling one of these young scholars to present him or herself to the audience of that year's version of the Institute. Thinking about this, it didn't take long to think of a name for this lecture, and it came to be named the Jean Vanier Emerging Scholar Lecture. I don't think that as the patron of this lecture, which Jean was very happy to be and to approve of, as long as I do not need to go anywhere. That was the only comment. No, you don't need to go anywhere, you only need to approve it. Yes, yes. But as a patron of this lecture, Jean Vanier really doesn't need an introduction to anyone who is familiar with the kind of conversations that we have. You will have noticed that that also this year his name has been around in many a discussion that we have had so far. Nonetheless, for those who are not familiar with that, he was awarded the Templeton Prize 2015 for his life and work as the founder and leader of L'Arche. But more importantly, Vanier, we think, exemplifies the aspiration of the Summer Institute to combine reflection upon the lives of persons with disabilities and their families with actual engagement in such life. So the intertwining of reflection and engagement is what characterizes his career and both what we want to do at the Summer Institute. So we set out an invitation to young scholars, and as a member of the committee who evaluated their applications, I can tell you we got 6 applications. Evidently, the first year, the lecture did not receive a very widespread attention, and I'm sure that will be continued to develop in the next years, which implicitly is an invitation to all of you that if you know young scholars, attend them to this possibility of presenting themselves to an audience. And the applications were based on the invitation for people who had recently defended their thesis. And we set out the following criteria for applicants. A candidate would be anybody with an academic degree obtained after January 2012 in theology, divinity, or religious studies, or another discipline that meets the second criterion, which is the subject matter of their PhD thesis is disability in relation to spirituality, faith, or religion. The overall research question was, oh no, sorry, that's a mistake in my text. So that was the second criterion. Subject matter of their thesis is disability in relation to spirituality, faith, or religion. We got, as I said, 6 applicants, and after carefully looking at their dissertations, we decided that the first Jean Vanier Emerging Scholar lecture should be delivered by Luca Badetti, which is a reason for applause. So you got that in your pocket already. Um, Luca Badetti is serving as the community coordinator of the Chicago community of L'Arche, and he has served for a number of years on the committee of and co-chaired the committee of L'Arche USA Inclusion, the L'Arche USA Inclusion team. But more importantly, for this occasion, Luca was in the privileged position, I think, is to combine his research for his PhD with his actual experience of living in a large community. And I think I do him justice when I say that the heart of what he has been looking in his research was something that he had experienced in the daily life of L'Arche many times, and that was the sometimes difficult relationship between self-determination and community life. We have asked the applicants that the candidate who would finally win the competition would not just repeat what the thesis had brought, but also try to expand a little bit on what the next stages in the research project, in the continuing research project would be. So we are very curious to see and to hear Luca on where your thinking is going, and I invite you to deliver the first Jan Vanier Emerging Scholar Lecture. Luca Badetti.
So, hello to all, and thank you to Hans Reinders, Bill Gaventa, and Eric Carter for selecting me as the first Jean Vanier Emerging Scholar. This is a great honor for me, also because Jean has been an inspirational person on my path of looking for a human vision. So I will be sharing with you today about the interdependent relationship between self and community, how important this interdependence is, but also what its shadow sides are. I will ground myself in my disability studies doctoral dissertation, in which I sought to explore the self-determination and the community life of persons with intellectual disabilities living in a large home. For privacy purposes, I will call this home Serenity House, and the names of the people that I've researched, we shall call them informants, are changed for privacy purposes. L'Arche is a faith community in which people with and without intellectual disabilities share life in a spirit of friendship. It is there that I sought to explore self-determination and community. I did so by doing a grounded ethnographic study. That means that I observed life in the home over a period of months. I interviewed informants, basically all the residents of the home, the assistants and the core members, which is how people with intellectual disabilities are called in L'Arche. And I gathered documentary data. From this data, I drew theoretical insight. You know, Jean often speaks of L'Arche being founded on the body, primarily, rather than the word. In other words, people come to L'Arche to meet people, to eat with people, sometimes to have them clothed or bathed. There is a very physical connection in meeting a person. While other communities or other groups might gather around an idea or a philosophy, you know, we all agree on a statement, and so we come together. But L'Arche is founded on the body. People come together because of people. So in some way, in my research and also in this lecture, I would like to pay close attention to the experience of people before we go into theoretical analysis. So first I would like to present some of the results that are relevant to the conversations today. So at Serenity House, the first thing that I sought to do is to explore how people viewed their own selves, what their self-perception was, and what their self-narratives were. In hearing their stories, which mostly was verbal, some people chose to use pictures, it was very interesting to realize how core members generally experienced some form of rejection or oppression during their young years, even if, of course, there were also stories of love and respect. For example, George had a very hard time with one of his parents, but said that his friends treated him with respect. While core member Matthew said he had a lot of good friends, but there was also a bully who threatened to kill him. Assistants generally experienced feelings of loneliness or of being different growing up. Assistant Helen mentioned not having many high school friends, and Paul not feeling loved by his parents. But there were also experiences of more secure love. One of the assistants had a very strong bonding with her sister growing up, and another felt accepted by her parents and secure with her friends. It's so true how joy and anguish and pain live so close together in our lives. Interestingly, core members generally did not self-identify as persons with disabilities. There was one that did, who is also a strong advocate for people with Down syndrome. But for example, core member Alfred said that he doesn't have a disability. And when I asked him, why are you a core member? He said, because I want to be one. Matthew said, I just feel that I am just me. I don't see myself, I know I have a disability, but I don't see myself, oh, I am a person with a disability. I inquired with people about their spiritual journeys. L'Arche is an ecumenical and interreligious community. Informants generally had their own understandings of spirituality, from being in tune to what's happening inside and around oneself, to meditating and going to church. Most of the informants came from the Christian tradition. After hearing how people spoke about themselves and how they viewed themselves, I focused on how they lived in community. What was their community life like? That primarily came from both observation and interviews. So first I inquired what community actually meant for people. We speak about community, but what does that mean? Bill Gaventa said something that I often go back to, and I think it's quite relevant. Community spirit is hard to define. We know it when we see it and feel it, and we also know and feel its absence. It is truly hard to define. Maybe images help us better. Belonging, forgiveness, celebration, acceptance. But maybe it's good that it's hard to define, because we're always discovering, and we can always be surprised by what it is. Core member George said that community is about making friends and living with people with and without disabilities. Core member Alfred said, us, you meet people every day, and they have a home here. For core member Jenna, community meant to understand our feelings. Core member Matthew said that to him, community meant where everybody lives together and try to get along with everybody. This is similar to what Assistant Michelle said, how people are mixed together in a house and you somehow have to figure out how to get along with the differences. Sometimes this also means conflict and the need to forgive. Assistant Jane said that in community, even if by the end of the day things went wrong, we are sitting down having dinner together. That was a good dinner. That's soothing, comforting. Most times, Jane mentioned, people will forgive you for mistakes made and conflicts created. Notice how in people's perception of community, the self is often contextualized in an interdependent way. Understanding other feelings. That means that I cannot put myself into your own self-experience and understand it. Figuring out how to get along. That means that we change in relationship to each other. How do we get along? How can we act when we are together? Forgiving when there is conflict. A change of heart, a change of attitude in response to you. This can be different from a group. You know, the difference between group and community. What is it? Assistant Ellen mentioned it quite well when she said that a group could be symbolized as many bodies walking together to a common goal, while community is one body made up of many parts. This reminds us of the Pauline theology of the body. In community, the parts of the body, the different selves that make community, affect each other. In the daily shared life in the large home, people cooked together and shared meals. They had celebrations, and they supported each other. Assistants had a primary support role, but core members supported assistants too in their own way. One evening, core member Jenna left the lights on in the house hallway because she knew that assistant Michelle was going to come back later in the evening. And she wanted to make sure that Michelle would not be wandering in the dark coming back home. And she wanted to help her out. People also shared spirituality. After the meal, people gathered around the table, passed a candle. It was an electric candle because one of the core members was afraid of flames. So it was an electric candle that was passed, the lights were turned off, people prayed their intentions, and then they prayed the Our Father together. Now, in Large, you have people from different faith backgrounds and faith walks. But how fascinating that this happened in community, that people could pray together and almost depend on this ritual after dinner, in which they could find rest in. One of the core members usually did not join for prayer. He was asked if he wanted to, but of course he was let free to join or not to join. This might sound quite nice, and it is great. But community also has an element of struggle. George, a core member with autism, often complained about there being too much noise with so many people around. Assistant Jane said, sometimes when people live so closely, I want to be private about certain information. Like, I'm a private person, I don't always share everything about me with people. But when you live together, it's like lady talk or friends talk, and they want to know about it. And I sometimes don't tell people everything. What does personal space look like when you live with a number of people? An interesting element of community life that emerged, and this was particularly relevant to self-determination, was choice-making dynamics in community. All right, if I want to do something and you want to do something else and you want to do something else, and we have one person that can drive us, what are we going to do? So I encourage to hear this about section about choice-making activities, not just about knowing who wants to do what, but about people navigating personal boundaries and what being in community meant to them. Informants generally reported choosing community and wanting to be in it. Core members actually reported wanting to be there, which is a good thing. Away from isolation. Interestingly, one of the core members lived in an independent living setting before joining L'Arche, and he felt lonely there. He had one roommate who was barely there, and he told me, "I like to have at least a meal with someone." He said each of us needs companionship, and he joined community. Core members generally mention making choices in community, and assistants, generally view themselves as supporting core members to make their own decisions. Some emphasized practical supports, like cooking, going to appointments, relaxation, and some emphasized psychological or emotional support. Through observation, however, a more nuanced complexity emerged regarding decision-making. For example, Assistant Helen described how one time she was the only person sharing time on the schedule in the home with 3 core members, 2 of which wanted to go to the bank, and 1 of whom wanted to go buy soda at the market. What to do? Ellen proposed that all core members go to the bank first and then to the market, or to do so in reverse order. The core member who wanted to get soda did not like this. He got very agitated. He started calling Ellen names and paced around frustrated. Ellen said that he was rough. She decided to sit, stay quiet, and encouraged the core member to take some space and cool down. He took the suggestion, went to his room, and he after came back much calmer. They agreed on a compromise of going to the bank first and then going to a restaurant to drink soda together. Notice how much people in this scene depended on each other's wants, on each other's needs, and now they all needed to find a compromise. Ultimately, the outing went well after the struggle. There was another struggle related to soda. Soda is a delicate matter, was a delicate matter in the house. But we might smile about it, but it's also a serious thing for some people who might not necessarily have a lot of options to choose from. Things that might seem small are very important. So this involved core member Jenna and assistant Michelle. Now, Jenna is a core member who has weight issues. And one of the responsibilities of the assistants is to encourage a healthy lifestyle. So, how do you navigate that when somebody wants to drink a lot of soda, and that's your choice, and assistants are encouraged to promote healthy eating? I think you only live into the answer. There is not a clear answer to this. But this is what happened. This is an actual excerpt from that conversation between Jenna, who wanted to get soda, and Michelle. Jenna said, "That's my choice. Can we go get soda?" Michelle said, "We just bought soda. Why would you need more soda? I thought you wanted to lose weight." Jenna, "I want to have a drink." It continued. Michelle, "I'd really like to come with you walking. If we make promises, we should stick to them." Jenna had bought soda just a couple of days before and promised Michelle that she would save some. It continued, "Michelle, we can go but not buy anything." Jenna, "I want to buy something." Michelle, "You bought enough for a week. I'm just afraid that in a few months you won't be able to get in the car anymore if you gain weight." It continued, "Jenna, I know that. I want to get something. I'm working on that." And Michelle continues, "You still drink as much soda as before, if not more, and then you start drinking a lot of protein instead of water." The conversation continued for a while. In the end, they agreed to go to the store and buy gum. This brings us to the shadow side of community, privilege and power differences. This shadow side did not come up explicitly from informant interviews, but it was clear in the observation and in my reflection. Staff and core members were on different power levels, both in their personal histories and in their community roles. It is important to examine and recognize this difference so as to inform a more critical understanding of interdependence in community. Although L'Arche discourse emphasizes mutual relationship of friendship as the heart of L'Arche, and it is, in practical terms, assistants and core members also have different roles and thus different power levels. The role of an assistant includes being a support worker as well, along with being a friend. Staff also seem to have greater overall opportunities and options in their lives than core members did. Almost all staff had college education, and if they didn't have one, they were going to plan for one after L'Arche, generally. And core members instead had less educational options. Many assistants had various opportunities for travel before deciding for L'Arche. And even though core members generally had various travel experiences, they were less tied to living and professional opportunities. During their stay in L'Arche, employed assistants received a stipend, which was modest, but still higher than core members' work salaries. In addition, as much as core members were given choice as to whether to continue living in L'Arche or not, their living options as persons with disabilities seemed much more limited than those available to staff. Although core members and staff did share a certain equality and solidarity in their living environment and shared life practices, assistants ultimately had a gatekeeping authority that core members often did not have. Assistants at times faced the challenge of navigating their responsibility as support staff with the wants of other community members, but ultimately had a lot of power in choosing whether to make an activity happen or not. Interestingly, however, informants did not bring such issues up a lot in interviews, probably because it's a shadow side and it challenges a more idealistic notions of community life. So grounded on this data, I wanted to share some reflection today with you on the reality of interdependence and what self and community mean in relation to it. In regards to the self, historically, the self has been the subject of great philosophical inquiry. It is not the aim of this presentation to summarize centuries of thinking about the self, but suffice to say that selfhood has been given different meanings across time and place. There has been a Kantian way of seeing the self as an abstract, transcendental pole of identity behind all experience. A 20th century understanding of the self as the constantly changing result of a narrative construction of identity. There has also been a phenomenological understanding of the self as a dimension that is already implied into any kind of experience. In some way, the writings in L'Arche have also spoken about self and personhood. We know well how Nouwen simply but meaningfully found the word beloved as being that which reveals our most profound identity. We are God's beloved. And Vanier speaks of the person as someone who is capable of loving. So, what emerged in this research is the self as located in community. We have seen how in community, selves are in constant relationships and affect each other. Core members and staff come with different histories, experiences. They bring their own preferences and choices. Their choices are made and compromised with each other. Some options are given and some options might get lost. Personal connections are made and personal ties built. We truly are all interdependent. Of course, at a fundamental level, we are dependent on God for our very life. Mystical theologian John of the Cross speaks of the substantial union of the soul with God. How basically God is present in every single person, no matter what. Without God, we would not be in the first place. Then he speaks of the more transforming union, which is how we, grow in the likeness of God through love. So we all have this existential interdependence, but we all have a very physical and social interdependence. We depend on our parents for our lives. I depend on people at this conference for giving me food to nourish myself so that I could come and speak to you, for people creating this space so that we could be gathered here and you could hear me, the audio technicians. So moving beyond an individualistic understanding of the self, Mead goes so far as to redefine the self as self-other, the self-other. We can talk as to whether this is a bit extreme or not, but suffice to say here that it is surely important to understand selfhood also in relation to the other. Closely related to expanding an understanding of the individual self to a relational self, data challenges the concept of self-autonomy. Actually, within self-determination theory itself, in the world of disability, self-determined behavior has been related to the person acting autonomously, with a functional focus on how personal actions enable the self to act independently. I would problematize such an individual understanding of autonomy. As exemplified in the ordinary life at Serenity House, core members made choices and received support from assistants, and core members supported assistants as well. Autonomy was embedded in social relationships, which shaped choice. In other words, informant choices and action were relationally embedded, interdependent on others' inputs and reactions. Feminist theory has done great work in moving away from the self-made man notion into a more, what they call it, relational autonomy. In other words, we are autonomous together in relationship, each of us. In regards to the shadow area of power and privilege, critical consciousness can be quite important in community life. That is a realization of power differences in community life so that potential oppression can be prevented. Of course, fundamentally, what helps us live interdependence well is love. And the way of love that Jesus shows can give some great insight on the relationship between self and community. I propose here 3 things that Jesus says that might be relevant in understanding how the self is interdependent in community. Of course, this is not exhaustive, but are just some images that I would like to leave with you. These are the 3 things Jesus says. What are you looking for? I thirst and I knock. So when disciples first start following Jesus, the first words of Jesus to them are, what are you looking for? What do you want? John also speaks often about this, how Jesus wants to put people in touch with their deepest desires. Kind of reminds me a bit of John Henry Newman focus on the primacy of conscience, of following what is deepest within you. And Jesus says something else on the cross. I thirst. Mother Teresa saw this as a cry of deep love. A cry for love, not just a physical cry of thirst. Notice how Jesus stands in solidarity with the poor, with people who were rejected. He was crucified. And he asks people to come close to him and to quench his thirst for love, entering into relationship. But he also says something very interesting. In Revelation, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and will dine with him and he with me. John says how this also shows the vulnerability of Jesus. Notice how Jesus knocks at the door, but doesn't push the door down. He respects our response. There is a freedom that is respects in us. So, what are you, as selves come together in community and live interdependence, what are you looking for? What do you want? It's not just what we want, because community is also for the individual and his or her growth primarily. So what do you want? What do you desire? I thirst. I seek to enter into relationship with you. I would like each of us to walk together. But I stand at the door and knock. You're free to decide what that means for you and how much you want to welcome me into your heart. In some way, these words of Jesus might help us to frame community as a loving path in which the self can grow in freedom and in which interdependence can be celebrated. Thank you.
Time for questions.
Yes. Is there the other mic up there?
Yeah?
The movable?
This one?
Oh, no, the movable.
This one,
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
Sorry. Who wants to raise a question or give a comment? There's a comment in the back.
Luca, thank you so much for your talk. I have been in L'Arche in Greater Vancouver. I've lived in a house and in a day program. So your stories of your research just resonate so strongly with me. I think you really hit a chord there. I wanted to ask about, you talked about how communities need to be aware of the power differences. What does that look like? This is something that me and my teammates have struggled with. We're aware that we have power. What do we do with this? How do we change how we are with people with disabilities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. We're aware from psychology how when we don't accept our unconscious, our lives might take a wrong turn. So already realizing and accepting the power differences is a great first step. Because once we do that, our vision and the way we relate to each other might change. On a practical level, there has been quite a growth in the self-advocacy movement of people with disabilities. So encouraging people to become self-advocates in a meaningful way could be a great way to do that. But of course, in community, both core members and assistants can advocate for what they like. I think this is important. I notice sometimes how some assistants might focus a lot on what core members want, and that's very important, of course. But I think in a mutual relationship of friendship, it's also important that I tell you what I like and what my life is about. So encouraging that mutual relationship, I think it's really important. And yeah, remaining aware of what the power differences might be.
Thank you so much. Related directly to what was just said, how do you navigate the tension between, on the one hand, there's a stipended situation for the assistants, and on the other, you want to have the mutuality of a friendship? How do you negotiate that within the parameters that we've been discussing around power?
Okay, if I understand correctly, how we understand the mutuality between assistants being staff and assistants being friends, was that the question? I couldn't.
And if they're stipended, how you talk about the friendship and mutuality?
Yes, so there is assistants that also come as volunteers, and some come, employed. Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think the L'Arche community I studied, and I think L'Arche as a whole is trying to come to terms with what that means. One of the things that we notice is that assistants generally come to L'Arche because they care about the experience of community. We know well that, these kind of settings are not abundant in, gold, at least money-wise. So people usually rarely come, to make the big bucks, so to speak. But they usually come with good intentions and a thirst for community. So I think that primary drive is kind of what helps keep that balance, but it's a struggle.
Yes. Can I just add a dimension to that? It struck me that when you characterized the respondents in your research, and you distinguished the two roles, member and assistants, and of the members you said the experience with that they come to L'Arche is a mixed one. It's an experience of being rejected, but also occasionally it's experience of being loved and respect. But it struck me that you said exactly the same about the assistants. So how does the fact that assistants come with needs similar to members, how does that affect the dynamic that was just addressed? Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yes. In that sense, the fact that L'Arche is also ask assistants to be professional and be encourage a healthy community life, we found it to be quite helpful because we have noticed how some assistants might have very profound needs, and sometimes this might influence how they live in the home. Of course, if the needs are so serious that community life might not be good for them, then we will need to, let the assistant, speak to the assistant and let the assistant know. But generally, we can work with things. So in community, we say that people are welcome in their weakness, in their vulnerabilities, and also in their strengths. But ultimately, we also want to keep this in check. We want to grow in community. We don't want to push each other down. So how do we find healthy ways to share our weaknesses? That's why we have emphasized going to the right person to speak about things, using resources from outside the community, whether it's spiritual accompaniment, psychological accompaniment, so that there is some sort of accountability as to how we share weakness together. Because that's really important, because I think sharing weakness is great, but in a safe space. And to create that safe space, we need the supports of our community and also external supports. Does that answer a bit the question?
Yes, it does. But perhaps I was thinking about the example that you mentioned of the young lady with weight problems. So she wants to have soda. Now, soda is supposed to be bad for you if you have weight problems. Let's assume that that's true. And then she says, and the assistant reminds her of all this. And she says, yes, I know, I'm working on that. And she wants to go and buy soda. Which, from a philosophical point, you would say, this is the classic example of weakness of will. Right? I know I need to do this, and I will do it, but not now, the other time. And so I was wondering, the fact that assistants come with needs that might sort of create, that might mean they might face similar kinds of issues. And I wonder how that would affect different ways of, probably different ways of dealing with this kind of questions. You must have a pretty robust notion of the self in order to say to that person, well, that's the wrong decision, because if you want to work on your waist, you shouldn't buy soda now. And that would be a final conclusion, and therefore we're not going to buy soda today. But if you are in similar sorts of, if you have been similar sorts of life experience, you might have different feelings of dealing with that. That's what I was trying to get at.
Yes. It's funny, in the research actually, always related to the soda, one of the assistants, Paul, shared a similar struggle. So that he said, that going out with Jenna to buy soda also gets him kind of, tempted to buy soda.
Okay.
However, that was there. However, I must say, there is a danger of a double standard, in the sense that Jenna was not allowed to go out by herself because of her disability and needs, and Paul could, and he did.
I'm wondering if you can speak on the issue of choice in power dynamics, because what was Jenna's assistant's name?
Michelle, I think.
Michelle. One of the ways that she could have handled that, with removing herself and her own needs from this dynamic, was to allow to enter into the possibility, the realm of choice, offering Jenna some choices, so that Jenna, and a choice would be a very healthy choice, but then Jenna gets to make that choice.
Yeah, this was just an excerpt. If I remember correctly, one of the assistants, I think it was Ellen, came into the scene and proposed to drink some tea or the like, and Jenna didn't want that. Yeah. So, but yeah, providing options, helping to provide options is really important. But often, if people want that specific choice, they can be quite animate about it, and it's really it's not an easy thing to navigate. Also, because and in some way this has been quite encouraging. Also, in disability support services, there is an increasing focus on self-determination. I think people sometimes simplify self-determination as what do you want kind of thing, but I think it could be a little bit richer. How do we come up with options? What options are there? How can I support you in this? So that there is a little bit more context. And maybe that can make choice making a little more nuanced and enriching.
Thank you, Luca, for I'm over here. Starting off the lecture series so nicely too. And I wanted to follow up a little bit, thinking about community and the assistants a little bit more in that discussion, because it's striking me that in your faith community you have an imam or a rabbi or a pastor who is compensated. At your bedside you might have a chaplain come by. There's this assumption that there's no friendship possible between compensated assistants. And I just, I don't know any statistics, but in my, experience, I know that it's not true. And I also know that they're not lucrative professions. And to enable, even to see it professionally, allows us to, think about the justice of compensation for the community, for the musicians who help us sing, the preachers who expand the word, and what that community looks like. And I see that as part of being an assistant in a community too, along with your own needs that you bring to that situation. One of them is, how do I live when I'm called to this vocationally?
When the first self-determination project started in the country in New Hampshire, there were 4 foundations for that: freedom, choice, authority, and responsibility. It was not just, there was the responsibility part about, if you're going to have the choices and to be yourself, you've also got the responsibility for yourself to the wider community. And I think you're right, the self-determination, sometimes people forget about that part, or it's totally about whatever I want. Sometimes people get out of that. But I want to raise the question, to go back a little bit to the, because I'm doing some thinking and writing on this same stuff right now, and one of the things, when you start asking people then to be professional, what professional assumes for many people are hard boundaries where I cannot be your friend. At least that's been the mythology of professional systems and disciplines. And it's mythology because it's in fact not true often. And part of the injustice about that, to me, it seems, is that professionals are taking all the power of being able to define what's a friendship or not.
Right.
So if I'm saying to Tamara, because I'm your staff, sorry, I can't be a friend with you, and I'm drawing all that, I'm taking all the power about that definition. And I know a lot of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who would say, staff are my friends. They're my friends. They're my friends. Right. And for us to go around saying, no, you shouldn't say that, you shouldn't say that, you shouldn't say that, and it's also a denial at some point of the mutuality of the relationships that's going on. So the question is, I think we're really in some place where we're really trying to figure out a new kind of thing about what professional means. I'm giving you a preview of my keynote at the AAIDD conference in 2 weeks. I think those are some of these are core issues for people, especially if you're talking about the role of professionals help people to become part of the community, which means the community in which those professionals also live, and who sticks with me over time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's Jason here. Thanks, tons, Luca. was great. I really appreciated your talk, especially also as a former L'Arche person. I appreciate it a lot. I'm wondering if you could mention something about if L'Arche is not a group and it's a community, that there's sometimes you can speak of L'Arche as a culture, even as a kind of subculture, with a particular set of values and norms, either explicit or implicit, and how sometimes that can contrast with the more dominant cultures in which they appear. And so Jean Vanier will sometimes talk about it can be very difficult for people to live in community when they've grown up in a certain larger dominant culture. So I'm wondering if you could talk about L'Arche as a culture and how that relates to the self, perhaps.
And how that relates to
the self.
Yes.
And how the self is formed and what even defines the self.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question, and implying how L'Arche is a culture and also a subculture. And actually, in each large communities, there is different cultures within that one culture. You have people from all different parts of the world, people with different disability experience, and disability is a culture as well, that come together and somehow have to live together. Somebody, while you were asking this question, one time I said, L'Arche is like a family. And this person asked me, what do you mean by family? Some people have very dysfunctional family. They might have bad experiences with family. So we, huh? So people do bring their own cultures, whether that's a family culture, culture with friends, etc. L'Arche has this interesting element, and if you've been in it, you might experience that across the different parts of the world that L'Arche is, there is a shared spirit that people feel, oh yeah, this is L'Arche. It's different in the US and in Calcutta, but the spirit that is lived is the same, that of entering into friendship. And friendship, that lens, enables us to see how cultures can be cherished and bring value to what people do, what people say, how they think. In other words, there is an acceptance that you, in your own way, can be celebrated and accepted from the culture you come from. And as you enter and contribute to this wider L'Arche culture. So yes, L'Arche is one culture, but it's made up of many cultures, of many selves that come from their own cultures. Does that make sense? Okay.
Nobody ever, as somebody said, start at the week, and there's Nigerian novelists, that nobody has a single story. Nobody has a single story. I wonder if any of the faith-based providers, there you go, thank you.
I don't count because I'm also L'Arche. I just thank you. I just met Luca today, but it's nice to hear your reflections. A comment related to what we were saying before around inclusion of people in their faith communities. I think so. It's not just about L'Arche. This dynamic about how is it possible to have friendship across difference. Of whatever difference, and there's always power imbalances across differences. That's true for faith communities welcoming. I don't think our culture has language for relationships that are either friendship and family. Those are known. There's not much language for people who are companions on a journey, who are not peers or related. And I think that the concept of friendship is so often associated with peer relationship where the power imbalance isn't great. And so what does it mean? So I was, many years ago, accompanied a man I used to live with in L'Arche, who I'm still in relationship with, and we were in Jerusalem, and I was helping him. He's Jewish, he's 20 years older than me, and a man asked, "Is that your father?" I said, "No, he's just my friend." And the guy looked at me skeptically, because here it was, he saw the intimacy between us. He saw how I supported him and how he was bringing out something in me. And so there wasn't a word for that. If he was my father, that would have made sense, that we had this bond that went beyond the power between us. But we were more than just friends, but we weren't peers either. And so that paucity of language, I think, is really important, because I think when people come into any space, whether it's L'Arche or any community where people can belong, how do we talk about this reality that we want to have mutuality or capacity for a deep and intimate relationship with the correct boundaries that are necessary. And I think that's a complicated reality when we don't have the language to talk about it.
Language-wise, I think one of the words you said actually hits the point quite well: companionship. Companion is a word that comes from sharing the same bread. And in L'Arche, which is quite focused on meals, that's kind of seen as the center of communal living, sharing bread is quite meaningful. So I think companionship has been a word that has resonated with me quite a bit in regards to what relationships in L'Arche look like.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think you're touching on a number of things here that are so important to many of us in this room and thinking through well. And I don't think we've done enough thought yet. But one of the aspects I think has been touched on here is we need a more robust idea of what friendship is, what care is, what these words mean that we throw around. And so John's talked before about the narrowness of our imagination sometimes. And I think that can happen when it comes to choice as well. And all that talk about soda has made me a bit thirsty. We call it pop in Ontario. But I have another little example of another situation that hopefully just expands our imagination a little bit. And I forget where this came from or which service agency it was, but it was a man who was in a similar situation who just loved Coca-Cola. He was passionate about Coca-Cola. He always wanted to drink Coca-Cola. And they came into the same situation that you were talking about. We're saying this just isn't healthy, right? You can't just keep drinking Coca-Cola all the time. Now this man changed service providers, and he met a very different response there. And the service provider said, "Oh, you like Coke? We're going to fill your closet with Coca-Cola, right? We're going to give you your own fridge filled with Coca-Cola. You can put posters of Coca-Cola if you want to on your walls." And what happened is that the Coke was kind of a sign to this man. It was a sign of choice and freedom. It was a sign that he had some control over his life. And so once he had that control, once he had all the Coca-Cola in the world, right, he knew that he was safe and he could make that decision on his own. And he actually ended up not drinking as much Coke anymore. So, I mean, it's just one example of how kind of our imaginations can be expanded in these situations.
Could I follow up on that? Because you started with the question, how do you negotiate this type of conflicts between communal life and self-determination? And it might just be that the way that we often conceive these kinds of concepts is just too narrow. There's a tendency to look at them as zero-sum games. There is a decision at stake, and either you win or I win. We either go to the shore and buy soda or we don't. And to bring in your element of journey suggests that wouldn't it be possible to bring some time and some history into these ways of decision making? And Key's example shows just how that might work. Because there is a condition on which, for this person, the possibility arises to sort of evaluate the relevance of the choice of wanting to have Coke. And as we all know, if there is an issue of choice and the person who is in the less powerful position gets pinned on it, it becomes a sign of power, because on any occasion you can say, I want my Coke. It's the best way to annoy your support persons, because this is the one thing that they cannot win. And so I have seen and I wonder whether you found it in the literature as well. The strategies that use self-binding. So, for example, in this case, okay, so you want soda, but there was this idea that you should try to control weight. Okay, so now how do you want to do that? And how many sodas do you want to have? And so what you try to find is, okay, where is the point? What you try to do is you try to put the person herself in the position of making the different considerations rather than deciding for them. And that all ties into an extended understanding of what professional relationships are, about how they include forms of mutual responsibility. And the trick is just to find how you can assign the person herself with responsibility by simply asking, where would you draw the line for how many sodas you want to go to have today? And so I wonder whether you came across these self-binding strategies where you try to figure out where the person herself would say, this would not be good for me.
I think one of the key, I have a couple of comments. One of the key points there is, how do we make some of this information accessible? It might be very hard for some people to conceptualize these kind of decisions across a time spectrum. For example, there is one core member that, if I tell him, see you in a bit, it's like, what's that? When? So it's like 7:37 or something, so he sees it on the watch. So maybe there is a beauty actually in living so much in the present that the conception of past and future is a little more blurred. But anyway, so with these kind of decisions, how much sodas have you drank in the past, and where is your weight going? They can be so abstract and hard to conceptualize. So we found that finding ways to make this information accessible is really important. The work of behavioral therapists has helped a bit as well. But what I would like to also address is there is a danger, and some people might criticize it, with defining self-determination only as what do you want insofar as we are economic agents. In other words, buying stuff. What do you want to get? And so we're part of this system in which production and buying things and producing things is what is seen as important in the human person. But a few questions that I rarely heard. I heard a lot, what do you want? But rarely, if ever, I heard, what kind of person do you want to be? How do you want to grow? I think that might take self-determination into a less sort of, okay, what shall we buy today? Into a more meaningful existential growth track.
Well, hopefully good person-centered planning would get you there, but
hopefully
it's also then saying, how do we provide an environment full of choices to help you experience the responsibility of those choices, and to go your one further, how do you want me to help you with that issue?
Yeah.
Not how I am going to help you, but how do you want me to help you?
And can I address that a bit? Okay. One of the tricky thing, and somebody, I think it was Alicia Carlson, if I'm not mistaken, did a Foucaultian analysis of inclusion, saying how tricky it can be when what inclusion looks like is proposed by people without disabilities. It's kind of me, a man, saying how women should live. It's that kind of thing. So how do people with disabilities actually want to be included? So it relates to that person-centered planning, and kind of having inclusion and self-determination actually come from their experience and not from the able-bodied, so to speak, or able-minded or whatever.
Time for one more question, I think. Yeah, Karen?
I was just really going, am I on? I was just really going to make a comment, thank you very much. But just back in the Coke
story between Jenna and Michelle. Some ways that I've found successful in looking at those kind of dialogues between two people, where there's a power thing between two people, is sometimes there's actually a third voice in that interaction, and that's the voice of the Coke. And if you can stand aside, I hope I'm making sense, but if you can stand aside and see what the Coke is actually there for, what the Coke is offering, and it's actually offering her probably Jenna, some form of pleasure, some form of power of herself. And if to stand aside and actually stop looking at the voice, or look beside the voice of the carer into the voice of what the other article is, sometimes gives a really great creative way to have a conversation about what other ways, what other things that we do that will achieve this same thing that the Coke is achieving.
Now I know where I'm going for sponsorship for next year.
Right. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's lunchtime.